Sometimes the most important decision in a marriage is the one you make after believing everything has already ended. That was the thought running through my mind as I signed the last page of our divorce papers. My name is Emily Carter. I am 37 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, I believed that every chapter of my marriage to Daniel had already been written. The courthouse in downtown Columbus, Ohio, felt colder than the late autumn air outside. People walked past us carrying folders, coffee cups, and ordinary conversations while the life we had spent 14 years building quietly came apart on a polished wooden table. Daniel sat across from me, wearing the same navy blazer he had worn to countless parent-teacher conferences and family dinners. His hands were steady. Mine were not. Neither of us looked angry anymore. We had exhausted anger months earlier. What remained was something much heavier. Silence. The attorney slid the documents toward us with practiced kindness. "Take your time," she said. Daniel signed first. His signature looked exactly the same as it had on the mortgage papers for our first house, on Lily's birth certificate, and on every birthday card he had ever given me. I stared at my own name for several seconds before forcing my hand to move. When the ink touched the paper, I expected relief. Instead, I felt as though I had erased a part of myself. We had not reached this day because of betrayal or dramatic secrets. There had been no affair, no screaming matches that shattered dishes, no single terrible mistake. Our marriage had faded slowly beneath years of long work days, missed conversations, financial pressure, sleepless nights with a child who struggled with severe asthma when she was younger, and a dangerous belief that there would always be time tomorrow to reconnect. Tomorrow eventually stopped coming. Somewhere between promotions, school schedules, aging parents, and unpaid bills, we became two responsible adults sharing a house instead of two people sharing a life. Friends told us this happened to many couples. Therapists encouraged patience. We tried date nights that felt like business meetings. We practiced communication exercises that sounded sincere inside the counselor's office and strangely empty in our kitchen. Eventually, even hope became another exhausting task to complete. Our 9-year-old daughter, Lily, knew we had been arguing less, but she did not understand that the absence of conflict sometimes means people have simply stopped trying to be heard. We promised ourselves we would protect her from the details. We would remain respectful. We would become the kind of divorced parents who attended soccer games together and never forced their child to choose sides. It sounded mature. It sounded responsible. It also sounded much easier than it truly was. Outside the courthouse, gray clouds stretched across the sky. Daniel held the door open for me out of habit. I thanked him out of habit. We stood together on the front steps with the signed documents inside separate envelopes. For a brief moment, we looked exactly like any married couple leaving an appointment together. A stranger would never have guessed that our future had just divided into two different directions. "I will pick Lily up from school today," Daniel said quietly. "That is fine," I answered. "She has piano practice at 5. I remember. There was no bitterness in his voice, only sadness. We walked toward the parking lot in silence until we reached our cars parked only a few spaces apart. 14 years together, and now even our vehicles seemed reluctant to separate. Before getting inside, Daniel looked at me one last time. "Emily," he said softly, "I truly hope you find peace." I wanted to answer that I hoped the same for him, but the words caught somewhere behind my ribs. I simply nodded. He drove away first. I watched his car disappear into traffic until I could no longer tell which silver sedan belonged to him. When I finally arrived home, the house greeted me with a silence that felt unfamiliar, even though no one else was there. Family photographs still lined the hallway. One showed Daniel teaching Lily to ride a bicycle. Another captured the three of us laughing during a camping trip in Michigan. I wondered whether those pictures would remain on the walls much longer or whether dividing. A marriage also required dividing memories. Around 3 that afternoon, my phone buzzed. Daniel had already picked Lily up. A few minutes later, another message arrived. "We are on our way home." Home. The word lingered in my mind. Which home would that mean a month from now? I stood in the kitchen pretending to organize dishes when the front door opened. Lily ran inside with her bright yellow backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She smiled the same fearless smile that had always made difficult days easier. Daniel followed more slowly, carrying her violin case because she always insisted it was heavier than it really was. For one ordinary second, the three of us stood together exactly as we had thousands of times before. Lily looked from her father to me, sensing something she could not fully name. Daniel and I exchanged one careful glance, silently agreeing that tonight would not be the night we explained everything. Then Lily reached into her backpack, pulled out a sheet of paper covered in colorful crayon drawings about families, and smiled with complete innocence before asking the one question neither of us had prepared to answer. Lily held the drawing with both hands as though it were the most important treasure in the world. Across the top, she had written in uneven blue letters, "My family." Beneath the title were three smiling figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Daniel wore a green sweater. I wore my favorite red coat. Lily had drawn herself in a purple dress that she had outgrown almost a year earlier. Children rarely cared about perfect accuracy. They drew the version of life that made them feel safe. She looked at us with complete confidence and asked, "When we move into different houses, where does my family go?" The room became painfully quiet. Daniel lowered the violin case onto the floor. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me and the ticking of the old kitchen clock that my father had given us as a wedding gift. Neither sound had ever seemed so loud. I forced a gentle smile. "Your family does not disappear," I said carefully. "It just looks a little different." Lily frowned. "But my teachers said families stay together because they love each other." Daniel stepped closer and knelt beside her. "Families can still love each other, even when they live in different places." Lily studied his face with the remarkable seriousness that children sometimes carried. "Then why are you and Mommy leaving each other?" There were countless explanations adults use. We grew apart. We stopped communicating. We wanted different futures. None of them belonged in the heart of a 9-year-old girl searching for something simple enough to understand. Daniel looked toward me. I realized he was waiting because, throughout Lily's life, I had always found the right words when she was frightened. This time I was just as lost as she was. I slowly sat beside her on the living room rug, where she had spent years building puzzles and imaginary castles. Sometimes, I whispered, grown-ups become so busy fixing everything around them that they forget to take care of each other. Lily remained silent. She looked down at her drawing and gently traced the three figures with one finger. "Can people remember again?" she asked. Daniel closed his eyes for just a second before answering. "Sometimes they can." She nodded as though storing the answer somewhere important. Then she surprised both of us by folding the picture neatly instead of hanging it on the refrigerator like she usually did. She placed it inside her backpack with unusual care. "I do not want to lose it," she said softly. "It is still my family." After dinner, Daniel left earlier than usual. He hugged Lily tightly at the front door. She hugged him back longer than normal, refusing to let go until he promised he would call before bedtime. When the door finally closed, the house seemed larger and emptier than ever. Lily disappeared into her bedroom without asking for her usual bedtime story. I quietly walked past her room an hour later and found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by family photo albums. She was not crying. She was simply looking, one picture after another. Christmas mornings, beach vacations, school plays, birthday cakes. Every page contained proof that happiness had once existed without effort. "Can I ask you something?" she said, without looking up. "Of course. Were you happy when Daddy married you?" My throat tightened. "Very happy." "Was Daddy happy too?" "Yes." "Then what happened?" I sat beside her and opened another album. The first photograph showed Daniel carrying me across the threshold of our first apartment. We looked impossibly young. We also looked like two people absolutely certain love alone could solve every problem life would ever create. "Life happened," I finally answered. "Sometimes life becomes so noisy that people stop hearing each other." Lily leaned against my shoulder. "I hope that never happens to me." I kissed the top of her head. "I hope it never does." Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, my phone vibrated. Daniel had sent a single photograph. It was a picture of Lily's drawing lying on the passenger seat of his car. Beneath it, he had written only one sentence. I cannot stop thinking about what she asked. I stared at the screen for several minutes before typing a reply. I erased 3 different responses before finally sending. Neither can I. A few moments later, another message appeared. Do you remember the cabin by Lake Erie where we promised we would always tell each other the truth? I remembered everything. We had been 25 years old. We had spent an entire weekend talking about dreams, careers, children, and growing old together. Back then, honesty had felt effortless because neither of us had anything to hide from the other. Somewhere along the years, we had not started lying. We had simply stopped talking deeply enough for the truth to matter. I walked to the living room window and watched the first snowflakes of the season drift beneath the streetlights. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Across the street, an elderly couple carefully decorated a small evergreen tree on their front porch. They laughed every time one of the lights slipped from the branches. Their laughter carried faintly through the cold night air. I wondered how many difficult seasons they had survived together to reach that simple moment. My phone rang unexpectedly. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered after the second ring. Neither of us spoke. Immediately. Finally, he said, "Emily, I keep hearing Lily ask where her family goes." I closed my eyes. So do I. He took a slow breath. I do not know what happens next. I'm not asking you to change anything tonight. I only know that signing those papers did not make that question disappear. We remained connected in silence for several seconds, listening to each other breathe across the distance between 2 separate houses that still somehow felt like the same home. Outside, the snow continued falling, quietly covering everything that had seemed broken only hours before. The following morning arrived with a quiet snowfall that softened every rooftop in our neighborhood. From the kitchen window, everything looked clean, almost untouched, as though the world had been given another chance overnight. I wished healing worked that way. Lily came downstairs wearing fuzzy socks and her oversized blue sweatshirt, still carrying the folded drawing in her backpack, even though there was no reason to bring it to school. She placed it carefully beside her breakfast plate before taking a bite of toast. "Can Daddy still come to my winter concert?" she asked. "Of course," I answered. "We will both be there." She nodded, but her smile did not fully return. Children could sense the difference between hearing reassuring words and truly believing them. After dropping her off at school, I drove to the architecture firm where I had worked for nearly 12 years. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm of meetings, design revisions, and conversations about deadlines, but my concentration disappeared every few minutes. I opened blueprints only to realize I had been staring through them instead of reading them. Around noon, my longtime colleague and closest friend, Rachel Morrison, knocked gently on my office door. She had known Daniel and me since before Lily was born. She took one look at my face and quietly closed the door behind her. "You signed yesterday, did you not?" she asked. I nodded. Rachel sat across from me without saying anything for several seconds. She understood that grief rarely needed immediate advice. "How do you feel?" she finally asked. I searched for the right word, but none seemed accurate. I expected heartbreak, I admitted. I did not expect uncertainty. Rachel leaned forward. "Those are different things. I thought once the papers were signed, I would know this was the right decision. And now?" I looked toward the snow-covered parking lot outside the window. "Now, I'm wondering whether we confused exhaustion with the end of love." Rachel remained thoughtful. "Only you and Daniel can answer that. But I have watched both of you for years. I never saw cruelty. I never saw betrayal. I only saw 2 good people carrying too much weight for too long." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That afternoon, Daniel experienced a strangely similar conversation without knowing it. During his lunch break at the engineering firm where he managed bridge restoration projects, his longtime mentor, Michael Bennett, invited him for coffee. Michael had been married for more than 40 years and possessed the calm confidence of someone who had survived every season of adulthood. Daniel did not mention the divorce immediately, but Michael noticed the wedding ring was gone. "Something changed," Michael observed quietly. Daniel looked down at the pale mark still visible on his finger. Emily and I finalized everything yesterday. Michael did not react with surprise. I'm sorry. Daniel nodded. The strange part is that nothing feels finished. Michael stirred his coffee slowly. Because paperwork ends legal commitments, it does not automatically end emotional ones. Daniel let out a tired laugh. Everyone keeps telling me I should move forward. Perhaps. Michael smiled gently. But before you move forward, make certain you are not simply walking away from something that still deserves one more honest conversation. Daniel remained silent. Michael continued, people often think marriages fail because of one terrible day. Most fail because thousands of ordinary days quietly pull two people apart. Sometimes they can still find each other again. Sometimes they cannot, but they should know which one is true before they stop trying. Those words lingered in Daniel's thoughts throughout the afternoon. That evening happened to be Lily's weekly piano lesson. Normally we alternated driving her, but because everything still felt uncertain, we both arrived. Neither of us had planned it. Daniel parked beside my car, and for a brief moment we smiled awkwardly at the coincidence. Lily seemed unexpectedly relieved to see both of us waiting together in the small music school lobby. During her lesson, we sat on opposite ends of the hallway with magazines neither of us actually read. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. Rachel called me today. I looked up in surprise. Rachel? She only asked whether I was doing all right. She said she hoped we were being kind to each other. I smiled faintly. That sounds like Rachel. Another quiet moment passed before Daniel spoke again. Michael asked me something today. What was that? He looked toward the practice room, where faint piano notes drifted through the closed door. He asked whether I knew the difference between a marriage that was broken and a marriage that was simply buried beneath too much life. I felt something shift inside me. It was not hope exactly. Hope was still too fragile to trust. But for the first time in many months, neither of us was defending old arguments or listing old disappointments. We were asking a different question altogether. The lesson ended, and Lily ran into the hallway, holding a sheet of music covered with her teacher's notes. Listen, she said excitedly. I finally played the whole song without stopping. She hurried toward the piano in the waiting room and played the simple melody again just for us. Daniel stood beside me without thinking. We listened together. The notes were imperfect. She missed two keys and hesitated before the ending. Then she looked up, searching our faces. Without discussing it, Daniel and I applauded at exactly the same moment. Lily's smile spread across her entire face. For those few seconds, nothing about our family felt divided. Driving home afterward, I realized something that frightened me almost as much as the divorce itself. I could no longer honestly say whether ending our marriage had been the only possible future. Perhaps we had reached the courthouse because we had stopped, believing another path existed. But belief and reality were not always the same thing. That night, before going to bed, I found Lily's drawing resting on the dining room table instead of inside her backpack. This time she had added something new. Above the three figures holding hands, she had carefully drawn a narrow wooden bridge connecting two hills that faced each other across a river. Underneath the bridge, she had written only 4 words in careful blue crayon. Still connected somehow. I stood there for a long time, staring at that simple picture, realizing my daughter had quietly expressed something neither Daniel nor I had yet found the courage to say aloud. The days that followed settled into an uneasy routine that looked surprisingly normal from the outside. Daniel picked Lily up every Wednesday after school. I took her to gymnastics on Saturdays. We exchanged polite messages about homework, dentist appointments, and grocery lists we no longer shared. Anyone reading our conversations would have thought we were simply organized parents. Only we knew how much emotion hid beneath every carefully chosen sentence. One Friday afternoon, Lily came home carrying a permission slip for her elementary school's annual winter family night. Parents were invited to decorate gingerbread houses with their children, drink hot chocolate, and watch the school choir perform holiday songs. She placed the paper on the kitchen counter between us while I prepared dinner. My teacher said every family can come together, she said casually, even if the parents live in different houses. I paused with the knife still resting on the cutting board. That sounds nice. Lily looked directly at me. Can both you and Daddy come? There was no hesitation in her voice. She was not trying to fix us. She was simply asking for one evening where her world could feel complete again. I will ask him, I replied. Daniel answered within minutes after receiving my message. Of course I will be there. Nothing more, nothing less. Yet I found myself reading those 5 words several times before setting the phone aside. Winter family night arrived beneath strings of white lights wrapped around the school's entrance. Children's laughter echoed through the hallways while parents carried trays of cookies and paper cups filled with steaming cocoa. Daniel arrived a few minutes after we did, wearing a charcoal wool coat and the same warm smile he always reserved for Lily. She ran toward him without thinking and grabbed both of his hands. Come on, she laughed. We have to build the best gingerbread house. For the next hour, we worked around a small folding table covered with colorful candy, frosting, and cookie pieces. Lily insisted that Daniel build the roof because Daddy measures everything perfectly. She asked me to decorate the windows because Mommy makes everything beautiful. We laughed more during that single hour than we had in months. Not because everything had suddenly been repaired, but because we had stopped trying to protect ourselves long enough to simply enjoy our daughter. At one point, Lily wandered to another table to admire a friend's project. Daniel quietly handed me a small peppermint candy without saying anything. My fingers brushed against his for barely a second. It was such a tiny moment that no one else would have noticed. Yet it stirred memories of hundreds of ordinary gestures that had once filled our marriage without either of us paying attention. Passing the salt, holding open a door, reaching for the same blanket during movies. Love had never disappeared all at once. It had simply become invisible beneath routine. Do you remember our first apartment? Daniel asked unexpectedly. I smiled despite myself. The kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people. We kept bumping into each other every time we cooked. You insisted that burnt grilled cheese was still edible. He laughed softly. I still believe that. The laughter faded into a comfortable silence. Neither of us rushed to fill it. For the first time in a very long while, silence no longer felt like distance. It felt familiar. The choir performance began shortly afterward. Families gathered inside the auditorium while children lined up across the stage wearing matching red scarves. Lily stood in the second row. Before the music started, she searched the audience until she spotted both of us sitting side by side. Her shoulders visibly relaxed. She smiled. Then she sang with a confidence we had not seen in months. As the final song ended, parents applauded while children waved excitedly from the stage. Lily hurried toward us carrying a small paper ornament she had made in art class. I made one for each of you, she said proudly. Then she hesitated. Actually, she looked at the 2 ornaments in her hands before gently placing one inside the other. Maybe they belonged together. She handed them to Daniel and me at the same time. The ornaments formed a single snowflake when connected. Separate, they looked unfinished. Neither of us spoke. We simply looked at the paper snowflake resting across our joined hands. Driving home later that evening, I realized I'd spent nearly the entire night remembering who Daniel was instead of focusing on why our marriage had failed. That frightened me because memories could be dangerously selective. They often highlighted the happiest moments while hiding the painful ones. I reminded myself that we had not imagined our loneliness. We had not invented years of emotional distance. Those struggles had been real. Yet another realization quietly followed. The people sitting beside each other in the school auditorium were not exactly the same 2 exhausted adults who had walked into the courthouse several days earlier. We had started listening again, truly listening. Not to defend ourselves or prove who had been right, but simply to understand. Late that night, my phone rang. Daniel's voice sounded thoughtful rather than emotional. Thank you for tonight, he said. Lily looked happy. She did. Another silence settled between us. Finally, he spoke again. Emily, I've been thinking about something. What is it? When we went to counseling, we spent every session talking about what was wrong. He paused before continuing. I cannot remember the last time we talked about what was still worth saving. His words lingered long after the call ended. I walked into the living room, where the paper snowflakes still rested on the coffee table. I connected the two halves together once more. The pattern became whole again, not because either piece had changed, but because each one still fit the other exactly as it always had. I stared at that fragile paper snowflake until the first light of dawn began to brighten the windows, slowly realizing that the hardest part of healing was not deciding whether forgiveness was possible. It was finding the courage to believe that something broken by neglect might still remember the shape it was always meant to have. Monday morning arrived with clear skies after nearly a week of snow. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, yet something subtle had changed between Daniel and me. We still lived apart. We still followed the agreement we had made after signing the divorce papers. But our conversations no longer revolved solely around schedules and responsibilities. Every now and then, one of us would remember an old story, ask about the other's day, or simply remain on the phone a little longer than necessary before saying goodbye. It was not reconciliation. It was recognition. We were slowly remembering the people we had been before exhaustion had become our shared language. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from our former marriage counselor, Dr. Helen Brooks. Months earlier, after several difficult sessions, we had informed her that we had decided to end the marriage. She had simply wished us peace. Now she sounded genuinely surprised. "Daniel contacted me this morning," she said gently. "I felt my heartbeat quicken." "He did?" "Yes." He did not ask to restart counseling. He only wanted to know whether I thought two people who had already signed divorce papers could still benefit from one final conversation. I closed my eyes. "What did you tell him?" She smiled softly through the phone. "I told him paperwork closes legal chapters. It does not prevent honest conversations." After hanging up, I sat quietly in my office for several minutes. Daniel had not called because he wanted to argue. He had not called to reopen old wounds. He had called because, for the first time, he was questioning whether we had truly understood what had happened to us. That realization stayed with me all day. When I arrived home, Lily was sitting at the dining table coloring Christmas ornaments she had cut from construction paper. She looked up with hopeful eyes. "Mom." "Yes." "Can Daddy eat dinner with us tonight?" I smiled sadly. "He is not coming tonight, sweetheart." She nodded without complaining. Then she returned to coloring. A few minutes later, she quietly said, "Sometimes I think grown-ups leave too early." I looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "When my puzzle is hard, you always tell me not to quit before I see the whole picture." Her words landed with remarkable force. She returned to her coloring as though she had simply shared an ordinary thought, completely unaware that she had unsettled every certainty I had been carrying for months. Later that evening, after Lily had gone upstairs, someone knocked on the front door. I was not expecting anyone. When I opened it, Daniel stood on the porch holding a small cardboard box. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said. "Not at all." He lifted the box slightly. "I found these while cleaning the garage." We carried it into the living room and placed it on the coffee table. Inside were old keepsakes we had forgotten existed. Concert tickets from our first anniversary. Postcards from vacations. Lily's hospital bracelet from the night she was born. Handwritten birthday cards. A faded envelope labeled simply, "Open in 10 years." I looked at Daniel. I completely forgot about this. So did I. We sat together on the floor, just as we had years ago while unpacking moving boxes in our first home. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 letters, one written by each of us on our 5th wedding anniversary after participating in a marriage workshop that encouraged couples to write messages for their future selves. Mine began with the words, "I hope we never become so busy building a life that we forget to actually live it together." My chest tightened. Daniel slowly unfolded his own letter. His eyes remained fixed on the page for a long time before he quietly handed it to me. "Read it." I hesitated before taking the paper. His handwriting was instantly familiar. Near the end of the letter, one sentence seemed to stop time itself. "If we ever reach a point where leaving feels easier than talking, I hope we choose one more conversation before making the biggest decision of our lives." Neither of us spoke. The room felt impossibly still. We had written those words almost a decade earlier, long before promotions, mortgages, aging parents, medical bills, endless responsibilities, and silent evenings had slowly buried our relationship. Tears filled my eyes before I realized I was crying. Daniel looked away toward the window. "I do not remember writing that," he admitted quietly. "Neither do I." We sat there surrounded by forgotten memories until Daniel finally whispered, "Emily, I think somewhere along the way we stopped following the promises we made because we stopped remembering who we were when we made them." I nodded slowly. Maybe we believed surviving was the same as living. He gave a faint smile. Maybe. Another long silence settled between us, but this one felt different from all the others. It was not empty. It was full of reflection, full of grief for the years we could never reclaim, full of gratitude that neither of us had become the villain we once feared the other had become. We had simply become two tired people carrying more than they knew how to carry. Before leaving, Daniel stood near the front door with his coat already on. "I've been thinking about something since winter family night," he said. "So have I." He looked directly into my eyes with a sincerity I had not seen in years. "Would you be willing to meet me this weekend? Not as parents discussing Lily, not as two people deciding anything, just as Emily and Daniel." I searched his face. There was no pressure, no expectation, only honesty. After several quiet seconds, I nodded. "Yes." He smiled, not with excitement, but with relief. "Thank you." When the front door closed behind him, I returned to the coffee table. The two old letters still lay open beside the faded photographs and tiny hospital bracelet. I carefully folded them back into the envelope, but did not put the box away. For months, I had believed our story had already reached its ending the moment we signed those divorce papers. Sitting alone in the quiet living room, surrounded by forgotten promises written by younger versions of ourselves, I realized something neither Daniel nor I had understood until now. The courthouse had ended our marriage on paper. It had never answered whether our love had truly reached its end. Saturday arrived brighter than either of us expected. The December sun reflected off patches of melting snow, filling the city with a rare kind of winter light that made everything appear softer. Daniel had suggested meeting at the small lakeside cafe where we used to spend Saturday mornings before Lily was born. It was halfway between our two homes, quiet enough for conversation, familiar enough to remind us that not every memory carried pain. I arrived a few minutes early, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already begun to cool while I watched people walking along the frozen shoreline. Couples pushed strollers. Older friends laughed over steaming drinks. A father patiently taught his little son how to skip stones across the thin edge of the lake where the ice had begun to melt. Ordinary lives continued all around me, untouched by the questions occupying my heart. Daniel appeared a few moments later wearing a dark wool coat and carrying 2 cinnamon rolls from the bakery next door. He smiled awkwardly as he set one in front of me. "You always order this one," he said. I looked at the pastry and laughed quietly. You still remembered. Some things never left. We sat together for several minutes without rushing into difficult conversations. Instead, we talked about work, about Lily's piano teacher, about the unusually warm weather. It felt strangely natural, almost unsettling in its familiarity. Eventually, Daniel leaned back in his chair and spoke with complete honesty. "Almost canceled today." I looked at him with surprise. "Why?" "Because I was afraid we would discover that we had only been remembering the good parts." I nodded slowly. I was afraid of the opposite, meaning that we would remember why we gave up. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly saying, "Maybe we need to remember both." His answer settled gently between us. Neither of us was pretending the difficult years had never happened. We had hurt each other, not through cruelty, but through absence. There had been birthdays interrupted by work emergencies, anniversaries forgotten beneath deadlines, conversations postponed until they disappeared completely. There had been nights when we lay only inches apart, yet felt impossibly distant. Those memories deserved honesty too. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded notebook page. I wrote something, he admitted. Not a letter, just thoughts. He looked almost embarrassed. You do not have to read it if you do not want to. I accepted the paper. Instead of accusations or apologies, it contained a simple list. Things I wish I had asked instead of assuming. Things I wish I had noticed before they became normal. Things I wish I had thanked you for while they were still happening. At the bottom, one final sentence had been written more slowly than the rest. I stopped trying to understand you after I started believing I already knew you. My eyes filled with tears before I finished reading. I folded the page carefully and slipped it back across the table. I have my own list, I admitted quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. I thought you might. We spent the next 2 hours doing something we had not truly done in years. We listened, not to prepare answers, not to defend ourselves, simply to understand. I admitted how lonely I had felt carrying emotional responsibilities that I had never fully explained. Daniel admitted how deeply he had buried his own fears beneath work, because solving engineering problems felt easier than admitting he no longer knew how to repair his marriage. We discovered that many of our greatest disappointments had begun with assumptions neither of us had ever spoken aloud. I thought you stopped needing me, Daniel confessed. I never stopped needing you, I answered softly. I only stopped asking because I thought you were already carrying too much. He looked at me with visible sadness. Emily, if you had told me that. I know. We both understood that sentence could never be finished. Around noon, we left the cafe and walked slowly along the lakeside trail. Snow crunched gently beneath our boots. The frozen branches overhead glittered in the sunlight. After several quiet minutes, Daniel stopped walking. There is something I need to tell you. I turned toward him. After we signed the papers, he hesitated before continuing. I started looking at apartments. I nodded. I expected you would. I visited 3 of them. He looked down at the lake before finishing. I never signed a lease. Why? He took a slow breath. Because every place I looked, it felt like somewhere I could sleep. None of them felt like home. I remained silent. Then I admitted something I had never intended to tell anyone. I packed 3 boxes after the divorce. Daniel looked surprised. 3 pictures, books, some dishes. I smiled sadly. They're still sitting in the guest room, exactly where I left them. We both laughed softly at the strange symmetry of our unfinished decisions. Neither of us had fully stepped into the future we believed we wanted. As we continued walking, Daniel noticed an elderly couple standing near the edge of the lake. The man carefully wrapped his scarf around his wife's shoulders while she laughed at his unnecessary concern. They moved slowly, supporting each other without speaking. Daniel watched them disappear down the trail before quietly asking, "Do you think they were always that close?" I smiled. Probably not. Then how did they become that way? I looked at the footprints stretching behind the couple. Maybe they kept choosing each other after every difficult season instead of believing one difficult season defined the rest of their lives. Daniel did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried more vulnerability than I had heard in years. Emily, I'm not asking you to forget everything that happened. I'm not even asking you to forgive me today. He looked directly into my eyes. I'm only asking whether you believe 2 people can become strangers and then learn who each other are again. My heart tightened because I realized I no longer feared that question. The answer simply required more courage than certainty. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. It was the school calling. Lily had become dizzy during choir rehearsal, and the nurse wanted one of us to pick her up. Without thinking, Daniel and I looked at each other, stood at exactly the same moment, and hurried back toward the parking lot together. There was no discussion about whose responsibility it was. No hosetaschen, no negociation. Only one shared instinct that rose naturally before either of us realized it. We both wanted to get to our daughter as quickly as possible. As Daniel started the car, our eyes met briefly across the center console. Neither of us said a word. Yet for the first time since the day we signed the divorce papers, acting together no longer felt like pretending to be a family. It felt like remembering that somewhere beneath all the silence, we had never completely stopped being one. By the time Daniel pulled into the elementary school parking lot, my heart was racing faster than it had in years. Every frightening possibility had already crossed my mind during the drive. The school nurse met us at the front entrance with a reassuring smile that immediately eased some of the panic on our faces. "She is all right," she said gently. "She became lightheaded during choir rehearsal. We think she skipped most of her lunch because she was too excited about practicing for the holiday concert." Daniel let out a slow breath beside me. I had not even realized he had been holding it. We followed the nurse into the health office where Lily sat wrapped in a small fleece blanket, sipping apple juice through a straw. The moment she saw both of us walk in together, relief spread across her face before either of us had spoken a single word. "I'm okay," she said quickly, almost apologetically. "I just got dizzy." Daniel knelt beside her chair while I brushed a loose strand of hair away from her forehead. "You scared us," he admitted with a gentle smile. "I am sorry." "No," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. "You never have to apologize for needing us." The nurse suggested taking Lily home for the afternoon to let her rest. Without discussing it, Daniel looked at me and asked, "Would it be all right if we both stayed?" I nodded immediately. Neither of us questioned whose parenting day it was. Neither of us mentioned schedules or obligations. Some decisions required no negotiation. Back at the house, Lily changed into comfortable pajamas and curled up beneath her favorite knitted blanket on the living room sofa. She insisted she was feeling much better after eating soup and drinking water, but she seemed unusually thoughtful. Daniel stayed longer than either of us had originally planned. Instead of leaving after checking on Lily, he helped wash the dishes while I folded laundry. The house slowly filled with familiar sounds that had once defined our ordinary evenings. Running water, cabinet doors opening and closing, quiet conversations drifting from one room to another. None of it felt forced. It simply felt remembered. Later that afternoon, Lily wandered into the kitchen carrying an old photo album she had taken from the bookshelf. "Can we look at this together?" she asked. Daniel pulled out a chair beside him. "Of course." We turned the pages one photograph at a time. There we were at the county fair, laughing over a giant stuffed bear Daniel had somehow won after missing nearly every target. There was Lily covered in birthday cake frosting on her second birthday. There was our camping trip in Michigan where it rained almost the entire weekend, yet somehow became one of our happiest vacations because we spent 2 days telling stories inside a tent. Lily laughed at nearly every picture. "You two smiled all the time," she observed. Daniel and I exchanged a quiet glance. "We did," I admitted. "What changed?" she asked. The question no longer felt like an accusation. It felt like genuine curiosity. Daniel answered before I could. "We stopped paying attention to little things because we were busy worrying about big things." Lily thought about that for a moment. "That sounds backwards." Daniel smiled softly. "It was." As evening approached, Lily fell asleep on the sofa with the photo album still resting across her lap. Daniel carefully lifted the book away so it would not fall. One photograph slipped loose from between the pages and landed on the floor. I picked it up. It had never been placed inside the album. On the back, written in my own handwriting, was a date from almost 10 years earlier in a single sentence. "Never forget this feeling." The picture showed Daniel and me standing outside the hospital only hours after Lily had been born. We looked exhausted beyond words. My hair was a mess. Daniel's eyes were red from lack of sleep. Yet neither of us had ever looked happier. He stared at the photograph for a long moment before quietly asking, "Do you remember what we talked about that night?" I nodded slowly. We promised Lily that no matter what happened in life, she would always grow up knowing she was deeply loved. And we kept that promise. "Yes," I answered. "We did." Daniel looked toward the sleeping little girl on the sofa. But somewhere along the way, we forgot to show her that love could also survive difficult seasons. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence felt heavy, but not hopeless. After making sure Lily was sleeping comfortably, we stepped onto the back porch where the cold evening air carried the scent of pine from neighboring yards already decorated for Christmas. Tiny lights shimmered across the fences, separating one family's home from another. Daniel rested his hands against the porch railing. "Emily," he began quietly, "I need to tell you something before I lose the courage." I turned toward him. "Go ahead." He took a long breath. "The day we signed the divorce papers, I accepted a transfer request." My heart skipped. A transfer. He nodded. The company offered me a position leading a bridge restoration project in Seattle. It would begin in January. The words settled between us with unexpected weight. Seattle was more than 2,000 miles away. You never told me, I whispered, because I believed everything was over. He looked down for a moment. I thought leaving Ohio would make starting over easier. I searched his face. Do you still plan to go? Daniel reached into his coat pocket and slowly removed a folded envelope bearing his company's logo. He handed it to me unopened. Yesterday morning, he said quietly, I called them. I looked at him without opening the letter. What? Did you tell them? His eyes never left mine. I told them I could not accept the position. My breath caught. Why? Daniel smiled with a mixture of sadness and hope. Because somewhere between Lily's question, that paper snowflake, our conversation by the lake, and today, I realized I was preparing to move thousands of miles away before I had truly fought for the most important relationship of my life. Tears filled my eyes again. He continued before I could respond. I do not know whether we can rebuild what we lost. I honestly do not know, but I know I would regret leaving far more than I would regret trying. I looked down at the unopened envelope still resting in my hands. Inside was not simply a declined job offer. It was the first irreversible decision either of us had made that moved toward our family instead of away from it. In the quiet glow of the Christmas lights, with our daughter sleeping peacefully inside the house we had nearly divided forever, I understood that the real turning point in our story had never been signing the divorce papers. It was the moment one of us finally chose uncertainty together over certainty apart. I did not open the envelope until after Daniel had gone home that evening. The letter inside was brief and professional. It confirmed that he had formally withdrawn from the Seattle transfer and would remain with his current engineering team in Columbus. There were no dramatic words, no emotional explanations, only one decision quietly placed on paper. Yet I understood the weight behind it. Daniel had walked away from what many people would have called a fresh start. Instead, he had chosen uncertainty. He had chosen to stay where healing, if it was still possible, would demand patience, honesty, and the willingness to face every painful memory we had spent years avoiding. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. For a long time, I simply sat in the quiet living room listening to the steady ticking of the old clock. A few weeks earlier, I would have assumed that staying meant refusing to move on. Now I wondered if staying sometimes required far more courage than leaving. The following morning, Lily woke up feeling completely recovered. She bounded downstairs full of energy, asking whether we could decorate Christmas cookies that afternoon. I smiled and agreed before realizing what she was really asking. Can Daddy come too? She added hopefully. This time I did not hesitate. I will ask him. Daniel arrived, carrying 2 bags of baking supplies and wearing the old apron Lily had given him years earlier with World's Best Pancake, Dad, stitched across the front. She laughed the moment she saw it. You still have that? Some things are too important to throw away, he answered. For the next several hours, flour covered the countertops, cookie cutters disappeared beneath piles of dough, and Lily declared every misshapen snowman to be perfect. Daniel accidentally spilled powdered sugar across half the kitchen floor, making Lily laugh so hard she nearly dropped the tray of cookies. I laughed too. The sound surprised me. It had been a long time since laughter had arrived without effort. At one point, while Lily carefully decorated gingerbread stars at the dining table, Daniel quietly joined me by the kitchen sink. Thank you for inviting me, he said. She invited you. He smiled. You said yes. I looked at the cookies cooling beside the window. I almost said no. Daniel nodded slowly. What changed your mind? I thought about the answer before speaking, because I realized I was protecting myself from being disappointed instead of giving us a chance to become different people. Daniel remained silent, allowing my words to settle between us. I'm still afraid, I admitted. So am I. What if we try again and nothing changes? He looked directly at me. Then at least Lily will grow up knowing we did not stop because trying became difficult. His answer stayed with me. Had started writing short notes to each other whenever one of us traveled for work. Over time, life had become busier, and the journal quietly disappeared into storage. Daniel opened to the final written page. The last entry had been dated almost 6 years earlier. It was mine. I miss us, not because we are gone, but because I can still see glimpses of who we are whenever life slows down long enough for us to notice. I cover my mouth as tears filled my eyes again. I did not even remember writing that. I whispered. Daniel gently turned another blank page. Then he picked up a pen from the nearby workbench and placed it beside the journal. He looked at me with remarkable calm. Emily, I cannot ask you to trust promises anymore. We have already made enough promises we failed to keep. I listened without interrupting. But I would like to ask something different. He rested his hand lightly on the journal. Would you be willing to start another page instead of pretending the old ones never happened? I looked down at the empty paper waiting between us. It seemed impossibly simple. Just one blank page. Yet it represented something far greater than words. It represented the possibility that our future did not have to compete with our past. It only had to learn from it. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the pen. I did not write immediately. Instead, I looked at Daniel and asked the question that had quietly lived inside me ever since the courthouse. If we do this, we cannot rebuild the marriage we lost. Daniel nodded. I know. It would have to be an entirely new one. A gentle smile appeared on his face. I was hoping you would say that. I lowered the pen to the paper. After several thoughtful moments, I wrote only one sentence. Let us begin by learning who we are today. I handed the pen to Daniel. He read my had ended. Neither of us was standing on opposite sides of the same question. We had quietly made the most important decision of our lives. We would stop trying to recover the people we used to be and instead discover whether the people we had become could choose each other all over again. Upstairs, Lily's laughter drifted down the hallway as she sang to herself while getting ready for bed. Daniel and I looked toward the sound at exactly the same moment. Without speaking, we both understood that this new beginning was no longer built upon memories of happier years. It was built upon a single decision made in the present, fragile enough to be broken, yet strong enough to become the first real foundation we had shared in a very long time. The days that followed did not resemble the ending of a romantic movie. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden certainty, and no illusion that years of distance could disappear in a single weekend. Instead, our new beginning looked surprisingly ordinary. Daniel and I agreed that before making any decisions about our future, we would spend time rebuilding something far more important than our marriage. We would rebuild trust, not through promises, but through She warned us against disappointment. Instead, she asked a single question. What would success look like for the two of you? Months earlier, we would have answered, saving the marriage. This time Daniel responded first, learning to tell each other the truth before silence has the chance to grow. I nodded, even if the truth is uncomfortable. Dr. Brooks smiled gently. That is a much healthier place to begin. Over the following weeks, we learned habits that should have existed years earlier. Instead of assuming, we asked. Instead of waiting until frustration became resentment, we spoke while problems were still small enough to solve together. We even scheduled one evening every Friday with no work, no household responsibilities, and no discussions about bills or calendars. At first, those evenings felt almost awkward. Two people who had once known everything about each other were discovering that they had changed. Daniel had developed a love for photography during business trips. I had quietly begun sketching watercolor landscapes whenever I felt overwhelmed. We laughed at how many new parts of ourselves had remained invisible simply because we had stopped asking curious questions. One Saturday afternoon, Lily invited us to her school's holiday craft fair. She insisted on introducing both of us to her teacher together. This is my mom, she said proudly, and this is my dad. There was no hesitation in her voice. No confusión, only quiet confidence. Her teacher smiled warmly. Lily has seemed much lighter these past few weeks. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it. As we walked away, Daniel whispered, I think she notices everything before we do. She always has, I replied. Christmas arrived with fresh snow covering the neighborhood. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, We spent the holiday morning in the same house. We had agreed it was simply for Lily. At least that was what we told ourselves. She raced downstairs before sunrise, still wearing reindeer pajamas, laughing as she discovered presents beneath the tree. Daniel handed her a wrapped box while I made hot chocolate in the kitchen. Watching the two of them together, I suddenly remembered dozens of Christmas mornings that had slipped through my memory because I'd been too busy planning perfect celebrations instead of appreciating them while they were happening. Later that afternoon, after Lily disappeared upstairs to assemble a new art set, Daniel quietly joined me on the back porch where soft snowflakes drifted through the still air. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I smiled. "You have been asking much better questions lately." He laughed softly. "I am trying." We stood together watching children build snowmen across the street. Finally, he spoke. "Do you remember the first Christmas after we got married? You bought the smallest tree on the lot because it was all we could afford. You decorated it with popcorn because ornaments were too expensive." I laughed. Half the popcorn ended up on the floor. Daniel looked at me with gentle affection. "We thought we were poor back then." "We were." "No," he said quietly. "We only had less money. We had everything else." His words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. That evening, once Lily had fallen asleep, I found myself standing in front of the bookshelf where our wedding album had remained untouched for years. I carefully removed it and carried it into the living room. Daniel looked up from the couch as I placed the album between us. "I think," I said softly, "I am finally ready to look without feeling angry." We turned each page slowly. Instead of mourning what we had lost, we noticed something entirely different. Those two young people smiling back at us had not possessed some secret recipe for a perfect marriage. They had simply been willing to face life side by side, believing that every challenge belonged to both of them instead of to one person alone. Somewhere along the years, we had accidentally begun carrying separate burdens instead of shared ones. As I closed the album, I realized something unexpected. The pain I had carried since the divorce papers no longer felt sharp. It had become quieter, transformed into understanding rather than regret. Daniel seemed to notice the change in my expression. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I reached across the couch and gently took his hand, not out of habit but by choice. "I think," I whispered, "we spent years believing our marriage failed because we stopped loving each other." I squeezed his hand softly. "Now I think we simply forgot that love is something people keep practicing, not something they finish building." Daniel smiled, his eyes shining with quiet emotion. Neither of us spoke again for several minutes. Outside, snow continued falling across the peaceful neighborhood, covering old footprints while leaving room for entirely new ones to be made together. Winter slowly gave way to the earliest signs of spring. Snowbanks along neighborhood sidewalks melted into narrow streams that carried away months of frozen silence. And in many ways our lives began doing the same. Daniel never moved back into the house. We made that decision together. We agreed that rebuilding our relationship deserved patience instead of urgency. Every meaningful step needed to be taken because it felt right, not because we were afraid of losing momentum. Friends and relatives noticed the change long before we spoke about it. We laughed more easily. We no longer looked exhausted every time we stood beside each other. Yet neither of us announced that we were trying again. We protected the fragile progress we had made by allowing it to grow quietly. One Saturday morning, Lily's soccer team played its first game of the season. As always, parents lined the sidelines carrying folding chairs, coffee cups, and blankets against the chilly breeze. Daniel and I arrived separately, but naturally ended up standing beside one another. During halftime, another parent smiled at us. "You two always make such a great team cheering for Lily." Daniel glanced toward me before politely thanking him. The man walked away without realizing how meaningful his simple comment had been. Months earlier, hearing those words would have filled us with guilt. Now, they filled us with gratitude because they reflected something we were genuinely becoming again. Lily scored her first goal of the season early in the second half. She looked toward the sidelines, searching for us. The moment she saw both of us celebrating together, She threw her arms into the air with pure joy before running back to join her teammates. Later that afternoon, while Lily attended a birthday party for a classmate, Daniel and I walked through a local botanical garden that had just reopened for spring. Tiny flowers pushed through the soil despite the lingering cold. Fresh green, leaves appeared on branches that had looked lifeless only weeks earlier. Nature is patient, Daniel observed quietly. It never rushes spring. I smiled. Neither should we. We sat on a wooden bench overlooking a small pond where ducks drifted peacefully across the water. Daniel turned toward me with thoughtful eyes. There's something I realized during counseling this week. What was that? For years, I believed being a good husband meant solving every problem before you ever had to worry about it. I listened carefully, but I never understood that sometimes you did not need a solution. He gave a small, self-conscious smile. Sometimes you only needed me to sit beside you while things were difficult. Tears gathered gently in my eyes because he had finally found words I had never been able to explain. And I realized something too, I admitted. I spent years believing that asking for help would only add to your stress. Daniel reached for my hand. You were carrying burdens I never even knew existed. Because I never showed them to you. We sat quietly, neither blaming the other, neither trying to rewrite history. We were simply acknowledging the truth with kindness instead of regret. That evening, after picking Lily up from the birthday party, the three of us stopped for ice cream on the way home. It was still a little too cold for frozen treats, but Lily insisted that spring officially began with ice cream regardless of the temperature. She sat between us at a small outdoor table, happily dripping chocolate onto her napkin while telling us an animated story about building a paper volcano at school. Halfway through her story, she suddenly stopped talking. What is it? I asked. Lily looked at both of us with a thoughtful expression. You smile with your eyes again. Daniel looked puzzled. What do you mean? She shrugged though it were obvious. For a long time, you smiled with your mouths because you wanted me to think everything was okay. She pointed gently toward both of us. Now your eyes smile too. Neither Daniel nor I knew how to answer. Children often notice truths adults overlooked completely. That night, after dropping Daniel off at his apartment, I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. As I unlocked the front door, I noticed the 3 cardboard boxes still sitting in the guest room, exactly where I had left them after the divorce. They contained photographs, books, and small pieces of a life I had once believed was over. I stood in the doorway for several moments before pulling the first box into the hallway. One by one, I unpacked every item and returned it to its place. The family photographs went back onto the shelves. The books returned to the living room. The handmade ceramic bowl Lily had painted when she was 6 found its place once again on the kitchen counter. I was not pretending painful months had never happened. I was simply choosing to stop living as though goodbye was still inevitable. The following Friday evening, Daniel came over for dinner as usual. After Lily went upstairs to finish reading before bed, we remained in the quiet kitchen washing dishes together. The ordinary rhythm of passing plates, drying glasses, and wiping counters somehow felt deeply comforting. Daniel finally broke the silence. Emily, I have not asked because I did not want to rush you. I looked toward him. Ask me what? He set the dish towel down carefully. Would you be willing to go on a date with me? I cannot help laughing through the tears already forming in my eyes. A date. A real one. He smiled nervously. No conversations about lawyers. No discussions about custody schedules or counseling appointments. Just dinner. 2 people getting to know each other again. I looked at the man standing in front of me. He was familiar in countless ways, yet somehow wonderfully new. The years had changed both of us. The pain had changed us too. But so had the work we had chosen to do together. I stepped closer and gently took his hand. I would love that, I whispered. Daniel smiled with the quiet happiness of someone who no longer needed grand gestures to recognize extraordinary moments. It was not the excitement of beginning a first romance. It was something steadier, something earned. As we turned off the kitchen lights and prepared to say goodnight, I realized that months earlier we had been searching for a way to save a marriage. Without noticing exactly when it happened, We had instead become two healthier people learning how to love with greater honesty, deeper humility, and a gratitude neither of us had possessed when everything had once seemed easy. And somehow, that new beginning felt far stronger than the life we had almost lost. 2 weeks later, Daniel picked me up for our first real date in nearly 5 years. It felt strangely unfamiliar to stand in front of my bedroom mirror, wondering what to wear. Not because I wanted to impress a stranger, but because I wanted to honor the quiet hope that had slowly returned between us. Lily had insisted on helping me choose an outfit. She studied 2 dresses with remarkable seriousness before pointing to a simple navy one. "Daddy always says blue makes your eyes look happy." I laughed softly. He used to say that. Lily grinned. Maybe he still does. When the doorbell rang, I felt the same nervous flutter I had experienced before our very first date all those years ago. Daniel stood on the porch holding a small bouquet of white tulips. Not red roses. Not anything extravagant. White tulips had always been my favorite because they reminded me of new beginnings after long winters. "I remembered," he said quietly as he handed them to me. "You did." Before leaving, Lily hugged both of us with unusual excitement. "Have fun," she said with a smile that seemed much older than her years. "Do not spend the whole night talking about me." Daniel laughed. "We will try." She folded her arms playfully. "No, promise." "We promise," I answered. Daniel had made reservations at a small family-owned Italian restaurant overlooking the Scioto River, the same place where we had celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary before life became so overwhelming. Walking inside no longer filled me with sadness. Instead, it reminded me that places themselves never held pain. They simply waited for new memories to replace old ones. Dinner unfolded without awkwardness. We talked about books, travel, music, dreams we had quietly abandoned, and places we still hope to visit someday. We discovered that we had both secretly wanted to drive along the Pacific Coast Highway, but had never mentioned it because we assumed there would always be more time. "We wasted a lot of assumptions," Daniel said thoughtfully. "We did. Maybe we should stop assuming there will always be another someday." I smiled. That sounds like something worth remembering. After dinner, we walked along the river beneath strings of lights reflecting across the water. The air carried the gentle warmth of early spring. Couples strolled hand in hand while musicians performed softly near the park entrance. Daniel stopped near the railing overlooking the river. "Emily," I turned toward him. "There is something I have wanted to tell you for months." I waited patiently. I used to think loving someone meant never changing. He looked out across the water before continuing. "Now, I think real love asks people to keep growing, even when growing is uncomfortable." He smiled gently. "You challenged me to become a better husband without ever asking me to become a different person." Tears gathered in my eyes. "You helped me become a better version of myself, too." We stood there quietly before Daniel reached for my hand. This time there was no uncertainty. I intertwined my fingers with his naturally, not because I was trying to recover the past, but because the present finally felt safe enough to trust. A few days later, we returned to Dr. Helen Brooks for what both of us expected would be our final counseling session. She greeted us with the same calm warmth she always had and smiled almost immediately. "Something feels different today," she observed. Daniel looked toward me before answering. "It is." Dr. Brooks leaned forward slightly. "Tell me what changed." I thought carefully before speaking. We stopped asking whether our marriage could survive. Daniel continued the thought and started asking whether we could become the kind of people who deserve the marriage we wanted. Dr. Brooks smiled with quiet satisfaction. "That is one of the healthiest answers I have heard." Before the session ended, she offered one final piece of advice. "Every marriage has seasons. Some are joyful, some are painfully difficult. Healthy couples are not the ones who avoid winter. They're the ones who remember that winter is not the whole year." Those words stayed with us long after we left her office. The following weekend, Lily invited us into the backyard where tiny flower buds had begun appearing along the fence. She had buried a small plastic container there the previous autumn as part of a school science project. Excitedly, she dug through the softened soil until she found it. Inside were flower seeds she had planted months earlier. Tiny green shoots had finally begun pushing through the dirt. "See," she said proudly. "My teacher told us nothing looked different for a long time because everything important was happening where we could not see it." Daniel and I looked at each other. Lily continued watering the small sprouts, completely unaware of how deeply her simple observation touched us. For months, we had wondered whether anything meaningful was changing. Yet the most important work had taken place quietly beneath the surface, through countless honest conversations, shared meals, patient listening, and ordinary acts of kindness that slowly rebuilt what neither dramatic promises nor legal documents ever could. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Daniel and I sat together on the back porch watching the sunset paint the sky with soft shades of gold and lavender. The old wooden swing creaked gently beneath us. "Do you remember the last time we sat here together?" I asked. Daniel nodded slowly. We barely spoke. I thought silence meant we had nothing left to say. He smiled sadly. "Now I know silence can also mean two people finally understand each other." We remained there until the first stars appeared overhead. Before leaving, Daniel turned toward me with quiet confidence. "Emily, I did not want to rush anything. We have taken every step carefully for a reason." I squeezed his hand gently. "I know, but whenever you are ready." He paused, his eyes filled with warmth instead of fear. "I would like to come home." I looked toward the softly lit windows of the house where Lily slept peacefully upstairs, then back at the man standing before me. Months earlier, the word home had described nothing more than a building we believed we would divide forever. Now it meant something entirely different. It meant honesty, patience, forgiveness, daily choices, and two people who had finally learned that love was not sustained by perfect moments, but by the quiet courage to keep choosing one another long after life had become complicated. I smiled through grateful tears and stepped forward, resting my forehead gently against his. "When you come home," I whispered, "it will not be because we are returning to the life we lost." He nodded softly. "I know. It will be because we finally built one strong enough to last." In the peaceful stillness of that spring evening, surrounded by the gentle sounds of neighborhood settling into night, neither of us felt the need to hurry the final step. For the first time in many years, the future no longer felt uncertain. It simply felt patiently, quietly, and beautifully within reach. 6 months later, the maple tree in our front yard was full of green leaves again. Summer sunlight poured through the kitchen windows as laughter drifted from the backyard, where Lily chased fireflies with the same endless energy she had always possessed. Life had not become perfect. It had become real. Daniel moved back into the house in early June, not with a moving company or a dramatic celebration, but with 2 suitcases, a camera bag, and the quiet understanding that this home belonged to all 3 of us because we had chosen it together once again. We never treated that day as if we were restoring the life we had lost. Instead, we celebrated it as the beginning of a completely different chapter. We painted the guest room into Lily's new art studio. We replaced old furniture that carried difficult memories with pieces we selected together. We created new traditions instead of trying to recreate old ones. Every Friday evening became family walk night, no matter how busy work became. Every Sunday morning, we ate pancakes together, even if they were slightly burned because Daniel still insisted they tasted better that way. We laughed about it every single time. One warm Saturday afternoon, we returned to the courthouse, not because we had unfinished legal business, but because the community center across the street was hosting a summer charity festival for local families. As we crossed the same stone steps where we had once walked away, believing our marriage had ended forever, I stopped for a moment. Daniel noticed immediately. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. I looked at the courthouse doors. I used to believe this place represented the worst day of my life. He slipped his hand into mine. "And now?" I smiled peacefully. "Now I think it was the day we finally realized what we had almost lost." We continued walking together. The building itself had not changed. Only we had. Sometimes healing did not erase painful places. It transformed the meaning we attached to them. At the festival, Lily insisted we enter the family three-legged race. Daniel laughed the moment he saw the sign. We're going to fall. Lily folded her arms dramatically. Not if you actually listen to each other. We all laughed. Volunteers tied our ankles together, and the race began. During the first few steps, Daniel moved too quickly while I hesitated. We stumbled awkwardly before nearly falling. Lily burst into laughter. Slow down, she called. Talk to each other. Daniel looked at me, smiling. Ready, ready, left, right, left, right. Step by step, we found the same rhythm. We did not win the race. We finished somewhere near the middle. Yet crossing the finish line together, somehow, felt more meaningful than any trophy could have been. Lily threw her arms around both of us. See, she laughed. You just forgot to work together. Later that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep upstairs with a book still open across her blanket, Daniel and I sat quietly on the back porch where so many honest conversations had changed our lives. Fireflies drifted across the yard. The old porch swing creaked gently beneath us. Daniel looked toward the stars beginning to appear overhead. Do you remember the question Lily asked after we signed the divorce papers? I nodded immediately. There was no chance either of us would ever forget it. She asked where a family goes. Daniel smiled softly. I think I finally know the answer. I waited. He turned toward me, his expression filled with quiet certainty. A family does not disappear when people become lost. It waits patiently while they find their way back to one another. Tears filled my eyes, but this time they carried no sadness, only gratitude. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the familiar scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Inside the house, I could hear the old kitchen clock quietly marking another ordinary evening. Once that sound had reminded me of time slipping away. Now it reminded me that every ordinary moment was another opportunity to choose the people we loved. I rested my head lightly against Daniel's shoulder. Do you know something? I whispered. What? I used to think love was the easiest part of marriage. He smiled. And now I know love is the reason people keep doing the difficult parts. We sat together without speaking for a long while, listening to the peaceful sounds of summer settling over the neighborhood. Across the street, the elderly couple we often watched were sitting on their own porch swing, sharing a single blanket as the evening grew cooler. The husband quietly reached over to adjust the blanket around his wife's shoulders. She smiled without looking at him, as though she had expected the gesture before it happened. Months earlier, I had wondered how two people became that comfortable with one another. Now I finally understood. It was never built through grand romantic moments alone. It was built through thousands of quiet choices that nobody else noticed. Through listening one more time. Through forgiving one more mistake. Through asking one more honest question before walking away. Daniel gently squeezed my hand. Thank you for giving us another chance. I looked at the warm light glowing through the living room. Windows, where Lily's folded drawings still rested inside a frame on the bookshelf. The picture had faded slightly over time, but the little wooden bridge connecting the two hills remained as bright as ever. Beneath it, her careful blue letters still read, still connected somehow. I smiled through grateful tears. We did not give ourselves another chance, I said softly. We learned how to become the people who could finally deserve one. The porch light cast a gentle glow across the yard as the first stars filled the summer sky. Behind us, our daughter slept peacefully inside a home filled not with perfection, but with honesty, forgiveness, laughter, patience, and hope. Ahead of us stretched a future that would undoubtedly bring new challenges, unexpected disappointments, and seasons neither of us could predict. Yet for the first time in many years, neither of us feared those unknown days. We had learned that love was never measured by how easily two people avoided difficult seasons. It was revealed by the quiet courage to keep choosing each other when those seasons finally arrived. And somewhere inside that ordinary American home, beneath the steady ticking of an old clock and the gentle glow of a family that had found its way back together, one little girl's question had finally been answered. Her family had never disappeared. It had simply been finding the road home.